Hello and welcome aboard. Today I want to discuss the Spirit of Fire and her crew and the importance they played in Halo's current lore. I was left in shock and awe after my last video when I saw a lot of viewers had not played Halo Wars 1 and 2, those being the games that the Spirit of Fire is featured in if you haven't put that together yet. But first, before summarizing the game, I should probably explain why they're important. So if you only played the FPS games in the Halo series, you may have played Infinite, seen the Banished, and been like, who are they? And how did they just steamroll the UNSC? And that's a fair question to ask, and even if you know who they are and you're asking that question, that's also valid. And well, the Banished were introduced in Halo Wars 2 as a new antagonistic force to fight against. Given by the time the second one takes place, Julim Dama's Covenant, well, they were dealt with. So I will summarize the events briefly leading up to the first game, the first game's conflicts with the Covenant, the events between the two games, and the second game's introduction and fight with the Banished. And then finally, what the Spirit of Fire has been up to since then in the Halo novels. Spoiler alert, that's a really short section. By covering this, it should help better explain the Banished to those who have not played the game, and also just show how important the actions of the Spirit of Fire were to the grand scheme of things. So that I'm not interrupting myself throughout the video, let's introduce Spirit of Fire and her crew. Spirit of Fire was formerly a colonist ship, but when insurrectionists started to pop up in outer colony systems, the UNSC would requisition the ship and refit it for a combat support role. It would not become a warship per se, but it would be armed to handle lightweight fights. Its main strength in war would be its vast storage areas. These spaces once housed colonists and everything they needed to start civilizations on foreign planets, but now it would house a large UNSC force and all of the weapons and equipment they needed to establish fire bases on the front lines quickly. The ship was to be captained by James Cutter. His extensive service record caught the eye of the UNSC leadership. He was chosen to captain the ship because of his experiences on similar vessels. Initially, he was offered the captaincy of an actual warship, but he declined that, wishing to stay closer to his family. Given the Spirit of Fire's role as a support vessel, he did accept this role. UNSC vessels typically have an onboard ship AI. Serina would serve that role in replacement of the ship's old AI. She does not have much history before the story of Halo Wars, as she was created 1 year prior to the events of the first game. So much of her background is actually fleshed out during the stories of the game and the comics. There was also a civilian researcher on board named Ellen Anders. She was kidnapped by the Office of Naval Intelligence and tasked with deciphering Covenant communications and eventually investigating Forerunner technology, although this was not the original purpose she had. Anders was chosen for this role as a recommendation by Dr. Halsey, but she was not asked her own opinion on this matter, so she's forced into this role, but she does embrace it. UNSC forces on board the Spirit of Fire would often report to Sergeant Forge, a non-commissioned officer on board the Spirit of Fire, who despite his rambunctious nature, was willing to go above and beyond to protect his people. Forge had a daughter back home, who serves as a prominent figure in several Halo novels, so if you've ever heard of him and not known who she was referring to, this is him. Also serving as leaders on the ground, Spartan Red Team consisted of Jerome 092, Douglas 042, and Alice 130. They would eventually lead forces for the Spirit of Fire after joining the crew during a point at the story. This Spartan team consisted of Spartan 2 washouts, which were candidates from the original batch who had their bodies reject augmentations. They were later able to be rehabilitated, and that's when they joined the fight. For the events of the first game, those are the most prominent figures that needed introduction. More characters will be introduced throughout the story as they appear. Now that you know the capabilities of the Spirit of Fire and have properly been introduced to its leadership, we can begin the story. Leading up to the events of Halo Wars 1, the UNSC had been waging a 5-year war, attempting to contest the outer colony planet Harvest. This would be known as the Harvest Campaign and would have many victories and also losses for the UNSC. Many ships were lost in space battles for this planet, and so there were several fleets sent to reinforce and replace lost vessels. The Spirit of Fire would be sent to reinforce the planet as part of Admiral Cole's 3rd Fleet in Battle Group D. Briefly before the ground battle, the Spirit of Fire would be sent on a rescue op to save the crew of the UNSC Prophecy, a ship that had been heavily damaged in an attempt to stop Covenant forces. It destroyed several Covenant ships but was set adrift. Although some of the ship's crew were able to be extracted before the ship's AI enacted Cole Protocol and self-destructed the ship, many died from radiation poisoning. If you wish to read more of this for yourself, check out the Halo Wars Genisis comic. On February 4th, 2531, after the space battle was won, the Spirit of Fire would commence ground operations. The Professor would detect Covenant communications indicating that the Covenant were on harvest because they were searching for something related to a treasure world. Suspicious activities were found in the northern polar region of the planet, so the Spirit of Fire would deploy to reinforce Alpha Base, which was closest to that source. During reconnaissance missions, the Covenant attacked the base and scattered the personnel. This is where the first game officially kicks off. Sergeant Forge would round up UNSC forces on the ground, and with the help of air support supplied by the Spirit, they would retake Alpha Base from the Covenant attackers. Once control was re-established, further reconnaissance was conducted and found that the Covenant forces, led by an arbiter, Ripamorami, had excavated a foreign structure, which we would now know had Forerunner origin. UNSC forces would be deployed to take the site and would reach it in time to stop the Covenant from sabotaging the entrance with explosives. Thinking the site was secured, Captain Cutter would allow for Anders to deploy to the surface to further investigate. Accompanied by Sergeant Forge and Marines, the Professor would venture into the structure to find a star map that pointed to a different planet, Arcadia Colony, another UNSC outer colony planet in the Procyon system. Anders' investigation would be cut short by cloaked Covenant forces that had been observing the interaction. In order to extract the Professor and the Sergeant, the Spirit of Fire would deploy Grizzly tanks to push into the structure and break up the Covenant presence. Once everyone was back on board the Spirit of Fire, the Professor would push for the Captain to investigate Arcadia, stressing the importance of whatever the Covenant were looking for. After getting clearance from Admiral Cole, Serina plotted a course for Arcadia. On February 9th, 2531, the Spirit of Fire would arrive in orbit shortly after the Covenant. Arcadia's defense fleet had already engaged the Covenant ships and managed to destroy one, but the fleet still took heavy losses. The remaining UNSC ships, the Armstrong and the Pillar of Autumn, were too damaged to continue their attack. Instead of finishing them off, the second Covenant vessel had broken off to engage in surface activity. The crew would receive a distress call from the Arcadian Patrol and Red Team, who were already on the ground requesting help in evacuating civilians from Perth, the Arcadian capital. Captain Cutter would dispatch ground forces to help with the evacuation, and once the civilian crafts were away, UNSC forces would regroup on the outskirts of the city before eliminating the remaining Covenant forces. With a foothold established, the Spirit of Fire could investigate further what the Covenant were searching for. An energy shield that doubled as a cloak had been deployed on the planet's surface in the jungle outside the city. Given the goal was to find what was underneath and not completely destroy it, Captain Cutter would abstain from using the ship's arsenal to try and drop the shield. Instead, Professor Anders and Serina devised a plan to use a prototype plasma rhino from the nearby Pillar of Autumn to fire on the shield and overcharge it. A similar reaction to what happens when an overcharged plasma pistol hits your shields. This plan would work, and once an opening was made, the UNSC forces would push into the area and find a stationary scarab defending an entrance to the Forerunner ruins. After ground forces destroyed it, Sergeant Forge and Professor Anders would enter the ruins to see what the Covenant had found. Instead, the two were ambushed by the Arbiter, who kidnapped Anders. After a Spartan Red Team recovered the Sergeant, Serina tracked the Professor's transponder where they saw it traveling outside the system. After some convincing from Jerome and Forge, Captain Cutter decided to pursue the signal through Slipspace. On February 23, 2531, the Spirit of Fire would exit Slipspace and orbit around a Forerunner shield world Trove. Here, Serina would continue to track Anders' transponder and find that the signal emanated from the planet's surface. Recon teams would be dispatched to investigate the source, however it was a trap, and the recon teams would be attacked by the Flood several decades before the Master Chief encountered them during the Battle of Installation 04. It was then determined that Anders' signal was being duped by a proto-gravemind. After destroying said proto-gravemind, Serina was able to resume tracking the real transponder. After navigating to the source of the signal, the Spirit of Fire is drawn into the interior of the planet. Before being able to fully pass through, the ship had to undergo quarantine by the Sentinels present in the Shield world. Sergeant Forge and other UNSC forces are sent to the exterior of the ship to help destroy the Flood on the ship's hull and fend off any Sentinels that became too aggressive and attacked the ship's facilities. Believing that the infection had been expelled, the ship was allowed to pass through the interior of Trove. After exiting the portal, the Spirit of Fire was face to face with the Covenant destroyer. Unable to maneuver away, the two ships collide.
Hard starboard.
Hard starboard, aye.
Having received too much damage, Serina was not able to navigate the ship to disengage the enemy, so Sergeant Forge would remain topside and fend off Covenant landing crafts while simultaneously making repairs to the ship's power core. After repairs are made, Serina is able to maneuver the Spirit of Fire away from the Covenant destroyer. After this, the UNSC would continue to track Anders' transponder. Meanwhile, Ripamorami is hastening his plans as the human forces grow closer. It is revealed to Professor Anders that Trove contained a Forerunner Dreadnought fleet. The Covenant had found Trove a while ago, but they had not been able to unlock the Dreadnoughts themselves. In battling the UNSC on Harvest, they had decided they wanted to use the fleet against humanity, but first they needed to discover how to activate them. That is why they were on Harvest and Arcadia, attempting to find a key. However, Anders' meddling allowed for them to make a different plan. Now that they had her on Trove, they used her affinity with the Forerunner technology and activated the Forerunner fleet. Shortly after its activation, Anders jumped on the opportunity and escaped to the ground, where she would rendezvous with Sergeant Forge. Professor Anders returns to the Spirit of Fire while Forge and Red Team secure a foothold on the ground. While the ground battle rages on, the Professor devises a plan to destroy the Forerunner fleet. This would require getting the ship's FTL reactor into Trove's internal sun and overloading it. The chain reaction would cause the star to go supernova and destroy Trove, the Dreadnoughts, and anything in proximity. Serina gives her concerns in the fact that without the FTL reactor, the Spirit of Fire would not be able to enter Slipspace. But with no other options to stop the Covenant, Captain Cutter clears the plan and moves forward so that humanity can stand a chance. While airlifting the reactor to the portal's entrance, which would take it the rest of the way to the Trove Star, the Pelicans met heavy AA fire, forcing the UNSC to transport it the rest of the way by ground. Sergeant Forge and Red Team would personally escort the reactor the rest of the way. When reaching the elevator, the remaining team encountered the Arbiter and his elites. While Red Team and Forge came out victorious, the reactor received too much damage, making it necessary to be detonated manually instead of being detonated remotely. Forge opted to stay behind and get the job done, and the Spartans returned to the Spirit of Fire to get everyone left out safely. While trying to leave Trove, the Spirit would find the portal they came through sealed shut. In order to open it, the team needed to open all the latches. After fighting through Covenant, Flood, and Sentinels, the latches were finally released as Forge detonated the reactor. Once all the crew members were accounted for, Captain Cutter gave the go-ahead to leave. However, since the star was going supernova, the gravitational pull increased so much so that the Spirit of Fire was unable to escape its pull. In an act of desperation, Serina plotted a course that took the Spirit of Fire around the sun, using the acceleration to escape the gravitational field and thread the speeding ship through the portal and escape Trove as it finally explodes. Without an FTL drive, the Spirit was stranded outside human space without an easy way back. It would take decades to return to human space, so the crew would enter cryosleep, with only maintenance crew being occasionally awoken to keep the ship running. This is where the first game ends. In between Halo Wars 1 and 2, a short story was made to bridge the gaps between the games. On January 1st, 2537, Serina awoke Violetta Maldini from cryosleep to perform routine maintenance on the Spirit of Fire. Despite the Sentinel's quarantine of the ship and the UNSC's own medical officer doing proper sterilization processes on board, somehow an infection form had remained stowed away on board the ship. While doing maintenance in a cryo bay, Maldini encountered the infection form that then burrowed into her and transformed her into a combat form. Having witnessed this, Serina put the sector into lockdown, but instead of purging the combat form, she instead decided to observe it. Several days later, the flood changed into a hybrid of a combat form and a carrier form, and with its assimilated knowledge of cryo, it awoke crew members and released its infection forms to make them into more flood forms. Seeing the snowballing threat, Serina quickly awakes Professor Anders from cryosleep to assist in the situation. Due to a subroutine in the ship, this also awoke Spartan Jerome of Red Team out of cryosleep. Unfortunately, his pod was located inside of the quarantined cryo bay, and that meant Jerome was surrounded by the flood. He then arms himself with anything he can find and starts to destroy the flood forms. After clearing the bay, he is informed that one combat form remains, and as Jerome approaches to eliminate it, the form reveals it had been hiding additional infection forms. In a last-ditch effort to help Jerome out, Serina opens an airlock, flushing the flood out into space. As Jerome and Anders return to cryosleep, Serina prepares herself for final dispensation, given that she's only a few days away from going rampant. This likely influenced her bad decisions that had led to this debacle. In her final days, Serina would pre-record briefings covering different scenarios that the Spirit of Fire may awaken to after she is gone.
Captain, wake up. Something has happened.
The second game begins in 2559, 28 years after the last one ended. The crew awakens from cryosleep to a situation that Serina could not anticipate in her contingencies. Upon awakening, Professor Anders and Captain Cutters meet on the observation deck to try to determine where they are and how they got there. Upon reading the Spirit's logs, they determine that they are outside the galaxy and that they had arrived an hour ago via Slipspace portal. Given that the ship's FTL reactor was destroyed on Trove, the Slipspace portal must have opened from the other side and pulled them through. During this discussion, a message from the communications comes through that they have received an encrypted signal from a UNSC frequency on the surface. Without Serina, it could not be decrypted, so instead, Captain Cutters orders Spartan Red Team to take a recon team to find the source of the encrypted signal. Upon reaching the signal's location, Red Team finds a seemingly abandoned research outpost. Entering the facility, they find a UNSC AI named Isabel, who insists that they leave immediately. Jerome retrieves Isabel, but instead of leaving, they investigate a disturbance. Closing in on the source of the noise, a massive brute is encountered. Given Red Team's Mjolnir armors and a date, and that the brute had the drop on them, Douglas is severely injured and falls unconscious. Jerome and Alice retreat with their wounded teammate and put him into the Warthog in order to proceed to an emergency extraction point, with the Spirit of Fire trailing them with orbital covering fire. To buy some time for the evac Pelicans, Alice stays behind and draws enemy fire until the Pelicans are safely away with the rest of Red Team. Upon returning to the Spirit of Fire, Jerome takes Isabel to the bridge where she briefs Captain Cutter and Jerome on who they just encountered. The brute that Red Team had just scuffled with was Atriox, and his forces were not Covenant, they were the Banished. Atriox and his brute brothers had split off from the Covenant after that being disillusioned by the Great Journey. As the Human Covenant War had raged on, Atriox and his Banished had gathered more followers from ex-Covenant to mercenary factions, making them a strong force that rivaled the Covenant even in its prime. Isabel goes on to tell the crew how the Human Covenant War had ended and that their current location is Installation 00, also known as the Ark. The UNSC had researchers stationed here until the portal to Earth closed, and after that the Banished had wiped them out. Furthermore, this place has the capability to make halo rays, weapons that are capable of wiping out chunks of the galaxy at a time. With access to one at any time, Atriox, or any of his allied factions, posed a significant threat to any opposing force in the universe. Given the odds, the Spirit of Fire's chances of victory seem slim, But then again, they had defied the odds before, and given what was at stake, Captain Cutters was willing to attempt to defy them again. So with the determination of the ship's crew and extensive knowledge from Isabel, the Spirit of Fire would once again prepare for a new war. Because of the strength and size of the Banished forces, the UNSC consigned themselves to small, powerful strikes until they could gain the upper hand. With their experience and with Isabel's ability to bring the ship's equipment up to date, the UNSCs initiated their first strike on a salvage operation led by one of Atriox's chiefs, Decimus. Jerome leads the strike force to assault this operation. After finding a Banished base camp, they reduce it to rubble and then set up their own forward operating base, using the supplies from the Banished depot as well as harvesting power from the Ark itself. Jerome and his team are able to muster up a sizable force to assault Decimus's primary operation. After destroying the base, Decimus himself comes out to fight the UNSC forces. Despite his strength and the supplemental bombardment from the enemy shipmaster, the UNSC are able to force Decimus to withdraw. In the rubble of the Banished base, the UNSC forces are able to recover bits of information that indicate the Banished are using the Ark's cartographer. Given the strategic importance of this location, they move to take it from them. In order to gain access to the cartographer, the UNSC seized control of 3 Forerunner control panels from Banished control. After a route to the cartographer is cleared, Professor Anders is sent in to investigate the interface further. While this is taking place, Spartan Alice has begun guerrilla warfare tactics on the Banished. She frees many UNSC prisoners and rallies them to receive a pickup from the Spirit of Fire. Captain Cutters then orders her to continue building up ground forces to split the Banished's attention. Back at the cartographer, Jerome and Anders finds the way blocked via Forerunner shield walls. In order to access the cartographer further, the UNSC forces must destroy several conduits that are defended by the Banished. The Sentinels also give some pushback, not wanting their nodes destroyed. Once Anders gains full access, she is able to determine that the Banished were using the cartographer's map to take over the Ark's portal network, allowing for the Banished forces to traverse around the installation rapidly. With the information gathered, the UNSC is able to exploit a vital component of Atriox's strategy. Since his forces are spread out across the Ark, if the UNSC are able to cut their access from the portals, then their troop movement would be severely crippled. Thus, the UNSC launched an assault on the primary controller. Jerome and Douglas lead a strike force that systematically takes control of the portal one by one. They keep this up as they push toward the primary controller, while also avoiding bombardment from the Banished capital ship. Eventually, they reach the controller, but is guarded by Decimus and his forces once again. The UNSC are able to eliminate Decimus and take control of the portal system, crippling the Banished's mobility as well as their command structure. Although Jerome and Douglas were successful in this mission, the Banished quickly retaliated, simultaneously attacking the Spirit of Fire with its fleets of Banshees and launching a ground assault on Alice and her forces. The ground forces attacking Alice had the objective of taking control of their portal controller, and although they send a strong force comprising of wraiths, banshees, locusts, and even a scarab, Alice's forces are able to hold down against the onslaught and prevail. The same cannot be said for the Spirit of Fire. As stated many times before, the ship is a support vessel, not rating for a boxing match against an assault carrier like the Enduring Conviction. Luckily for the time being, the enemy carrier is not in range to directly fire on the Spirit of Fire, but its swarms of banshees alone were enough to put the squeeze on the Spirit, making multiple hull breaches and crippling several of the ship's point defense weapons. At this point, Isabel concocted a plan. Isabel and Jerome were to infiltrate the assault carrier, but to do that, they would need help from the rest of Red Team. Douglas and his forces were sent to take control of a Forerunner particle cannon, which he used to punch a hole in the Enduring Conviction shields. Because the Banished were cut off from their portal network, the UNSC forces only had to fend off traditional ground forces until the Banished diverted some of their Banshees to the particle cannon. This also bought some more time for the Spirit of Fire. Meanwhile, Jerome and Alice were securing the gravity lift underneath the assault carrier. The split UNSC forces did this strategically by taking the area around the gravity lift first, then setting up Kodiak artillery batteries that would simultaneously launch one final barrage to clear the gravity lift at the same time as the particle cannon punched through the carrier's shield. Jerome and Isabel were able to enter the ship successfully. While Jerome fights off hordes of enemies, Isabel hacks into the Banished's weapon system and begins to glass the Ark. The damage being caused by the glassing beam agitates the Ark's Sentinels, and in order to prevent further damage, the Sentinels begin to attack the carrier in swarms. Despite their efforts, the Banished are unable to stop Jerome and Isabel. Eventually, the Sentinels do enough damage to bisect the Enduring Conviction, destroying it. With the job done and the Spirit of Fire safe for now, Jerome and Isabel escape the carrier. While this battle has been raging on, Professor Anders has been making a plan to re-establish contact with the rest of the UNSC. The plan involved launching a new Halo array, disarming it, and sending it to the location of the original Halo ring that was found near Reach. This would put it in range of a comms beacon. After the destruction of the assault carrier, this plan was able to commence. After the ring had launched from the Ark, the UNSC began landing troops and supplies in order to secure the ring. Despite the Banished ships being destroyed, they were still able to get onto the Halo through portal nodes that the Ark had opened to transport Sentinels. At this point, it became a battle for the Halo ring. Douglas and Alice landed on the ring with the goal of capturing an enemy Scarab and dismantling enemy barricades. Despite heavy resistance, the Spartans successfully hijacked the Scarab and used it to smash through barricades and eventually reached the shutdown control for the transportation nodes being used by the Banished. All of Red Team then regrouped at Alpha Base on the ring, with the goal of regrouping UNSC forces to make a push towards the ring's control room. While fighting for control, the ring deployed a Retriever Sentinel as a defense mechanism. This would cause havoc for both factions, and after securing the area, Anders is able to take control of the Retriever and use it to access the control room. Once Anders entered the control room, the Banished sends its full force to try to take control. And in order to hold out, the Spirit of Fire starts using its entire arsenal to defend the area. During this fight, the UNSC formed a perimeter around the control room, blocking the entire Banished force as it came down on them at once. After destroying multiple Scarabs and several brute warlords, the Spirit of Fire finally held out long enough for Anders to gain full access to the Halo. With control of the installation, she was able to forcibly remove the remaining Banished and gain full control for the UNSC. Having won the battle, the Spirit of Fire begins to withdraw its troops from the Halo ring, which is preparing to enter Slipspace. Despite the armed forces successfully withdrawing, Professor Anders was not able to be extracted before the ring entered Slipspace. She leaves with a final message that she promises to return with help from the Soel system. While waiting for Anders to return, Captain Cutters and the Spirit of Fire continues operations against the Banished that remained on the Ark. Although this is where the main story of the game ends, this is not where the game ends. The story picks back up with a DLC. 1 month after the Halo launch, ODSTs spotted Banished engineers working under a cloaked area. In response, the Spirit of Fire dispatched Boomerang Company to investigate the suspicious activity. Vaughn and his ODSTs landed a few kilometers away from the cloaked area and began operations to find what the Banished were up to. Boomerang Company would encroach on the Banished territory and take control of Forerunner control towers to drop the cloaking field. By doing so, the local Sentinels were agitated and dispatched a Retriever to attack the ODSTs. Once the Retriever was dealt with, the cloaking field was dropped and underneath a Forerunner ship was revealed. The Banished were not launching this ship to escape the Ark. It seemed that they were planning to launch it into the Spirit of Fire in an attempt to destroy the ship. Boomerang delayed the launch by disrupting charging beams with a Colossus mech. Although this delayed the launch, it was not able to stop it. In order to stop the launch, Vaughn used his troops to assault the area around the vessel so that ODST Quinn could get close enough and stop the ship from launching. In a last-ditch effort to retake control of the area, the Banished sent a hunter captain to attack the company. However, the attack failed and the area was secured. In order to stop future attempts of weaponizing the ship, Boomer and company scuttled the ship as opposed to holding the area against the Banished. And this is where the game's story officially ends. But you might be asking, if the Banished are stuck on the Ark, how do they show up in Halo Infinite? And the reason for that is because the Banished's entire force is not on the Ark. They have other fleets. And you're saying, well, Atriox is stuck on the Ark. How did he reach the Infinity in Halo Infinite? That was explained in a novel called Halo Divine Winds. In October, a new faction would arrive at the Ark, the Keepers of One Freedom. This was a remnant faction of the Covenant. It held their religious beliefs, but proclaimed that the Sanshayum were false prophets, and they would accept any species into their covenant, including humans. The Keepers arrived on the Ark with the intent to fire the Halo rings and commence the Great Journey, falsely aligning themselves with the Banished. Unbeknownst to them, the humans and their faction were actually a ferret squad. Ferrets are Oni operatives that infiltrate deep into other factions, carrying out hits or just gathering intelligence for Oni, anything necessary. Ferret Team would signal to the Spirit of Fire's forces to get assistance with stopping the Keepers from achieving their plans. At the team's signal, the Spirit of Fire bombarded key locations, thus sabotaging their plans. After the battle, Red Team was dispatched to recover the survivors of the Ferrets, who then joined and helped fight the remaining Banished on the Ark. As during the battle, Atriox and his higher chain of command had left through a Slipspace portal that led to Reach. And that is the last we have heard of the Spirit of Fire as of right now, or at least as to my knowledge through novels, comics, games, any media I have actually been through, which is a lot. I certainly didn't cover everything and not in the best detail, but I felt like that was the most important information to cover for anybody who is not in the loop, in the know, whatever you want to say. I just saw in my last video how many viewers had not played or seemingly watched Halo Wars, so I just had to make this video because in my opinion, the Spirit of Fire and her crew is one of my favorite pieces of overall lore. I mean, if you've seen my video about the Spirit of Fire operation, whatever it's called on Infinite, you know that I just love that stuff. Anyways, thank you for watching and or listening to the end of the video. I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed it if you didn't play the games. If you did play the games and you think I missummarized anything, please make corrections in the comments below. But I did do a full playthrough just for this video and I went through all the bonus content you can find in the games, which some of it could be out of date. That was true for previous Halo games, I know that. So, you gotta love retcons. Anyways, thank you again. I appreciate your guys' support. Like, subscribe, comment. All those help the channel a lot. But until the next video, bye-bye.